Hey y'all, we are doing something a little different this time. So this isn't technically like a Climbing the Labyrinth podcast. During my schooling for getting a doctorate, one of the classes that I'm taking is a history class. And during that, we have to take some primary sources, as in like things that actually people wrote from history, and work through them and come up with a curriculum. So approximately five lessons. And what I decided to do that I thought might be helpful or something interesting to the church or to people that actually watch this channel is do something on the very early church, or at least the hopefully early church. And that is a primary text called the Didache. It's a Greek word that just simply means teaching. I'll put a little box up there, so you can see. This is sorry if you can't if you're young and if you're a millennial or younger and you can't read cursive. I apologize, but just is that way. Didache, or the actual name of it in the fuller text when you read through in the beginning portion, is the teaching of the Lord to the Gentiles by the 12 apostles. So the teaching of the 12, or the apostles' teaching, or there was a number of documents in the early church that kind of had similar names to this, but this is a document that only recently surfaced. Let me see if I can, I'll click on this and go through it. This is actually, if you look here, this is actually a fragment of the papyrus, the script, or the what's the word? It's escaping me now. The scroll. The scroll that was found in Constantinople around 1873, I believe. We'll get into more of that in a second. But so here's the scroll, and this is a portion of the Didache, and I blew up the contrast and some stuff so you can sort of see a little bit of the Greek text. But as we look at this, here's the thing, is there will be approximately 5 lessons. The first one, I'm just going to give a little bit of history and some background, basically just listen and watch. And then as we get into number 2, 3, 4, and 5, then what I will do is I've broken down the actual document of the Didache into 4 sections. And during those 4 sections, we'll read through them and I'll give some comment, and then I maybe have some questions that you can use for discussion stuff or small group or whatever, or just for your own thought process, and try to draw some correlations of maybe how this was important during the early church and how maybe we've lost a few of those elements that the early church had. Just a number of things. In the similar format that I use for other things is I will put the text on the screen and read through it and talk about it, give some practical, more exposition of what's going on here. During that time is the simple fact that it'll be on the screen and you can see it. I'll show you. I actually, this is the original one that I used from. This is Early Christian Fathers by Cyril Richardson. Maybe there you can get a little zoom in, and I can put that maybe somewhere in the tag somewhere. But he has a number of documents from the early Christian church, and let's see here. Anyway, a lot of them, a lot of early letters and stuff that people don't normally talk about or normally hear of. So that was the original text that I used. And then during seminary, in some Greek reading classes that I had, I asked if we could read some early church fathers' letters, because then you don't know what it's supposed to say. So when you have to translate the Greek, it's a little tougher, but you have to be more intentional. You can't just go from memory when you know the scripture verse already, like you've already heard it before. So I got this book, The Apostolic Fathers, by Michael Holmes. He is, I think his PhD is from Princeton Seminary, and he teaches at Bethel College. So from the Midwest here, I think that's just Bethel up in Minneapolis. The thing with this is, I'll open it up and you can see, on one side is English and on the other side is the Greek. So you can see both of them. So that's the text that I'll probably work from, and I may just for the sake of this, no copyright infringement intended, put that up on the screen that when we go through, just so you can kind of see what I'm looking at. But those are two options if you want to pick one up. Otherwise, there are a number of places online that you can find them. You can actually find the Cyril Richardson text at, I think it's Bible.org, that has a whole bunch of stuff, or BibleHub.org, I think. I'll look it up before we go through it in the next session and put it up on the screen so you can see that. Anyway, let's get back to just the history, because I don't want these to be really long sessions. So the general aspect here is we're looking at the Didache, the teaching of the 12, which was attributed to the apostles, though probably not so much. Like in the early church, the desire was to give it credence and give it credibility. They would attribute it to specific people that walked with Jesus, that led in the early church. And so things are given the label. For example, one of the scrolls that was found within the last 15, 20 years, I believe, at Nag Hammadi was the Gospel of Thomas. And you look at that and you go, oh, is that something new? Well, it's got Thomas's name on it. But all of the history and the evidence and the internal evidence shows that probably comes from like 200 to 300 AD. And so it wasn't actually Thomas. It was just them giving it the name of Thomas to get it more kind of credence. Here what we have is somebody puts together a document called the Didache, the teaching of the 12, and somebody actually found it. So we didn't have it for a really long time. The scroll itself was kind of lost to history until, let me put him up here, Philotheos is a Greek word. This is actually, I think he is... I'm sure he's within the Orthodox tradition because he was in Constantinople when he found it. Berenius. So philo, love, like Philadelphia, brotherly love. Theos, God. So the lover of God. And he finds it in 1873 as he's going through kind of some things in Constantinople, modern-day Turkey, Istanbul. He goes through, and this is what is considered now, it's called the Jerusalem Codex, and it was actually copied by a scribe named Leo in 1056. So in church history-wise, this was right after the schism between the West Roman Catholic Church and the East Orthodox Church. Then Leo writes out in Greek what we have here. So he got it from somewhere else, and this is him writing it out. It's the earliest manuscript that we have of it. And the struggle then is how do you get a date for something that was copied in 1056 and wasn't found until almost 1900? I mean, we're talking 1900 is not that long ago in the span of history. It seems like a really long time because we're in the 2020s, but it's really not that long in the span of history and world history. So we get this on the scene, and then the question is the date. As you go through the date, the simple kind of raw, easiest way to say is somewhere between 50 and 150. So that would be Common Era or AD in the church. When we look at this, then the struggle becomes as if it's during 50 or even before 100, then you're talking a document that was around when the early church was founded, when Paul was beginning to go out. I mean, the earliest letters, whether you are of a Galatians is the earliest around 48, or maybe around that same time would be James. I think James is probably the earliest, with Galatians right after it, around 48, 49, before Paul heads out, and then Thessalonians. And so these early documents, even before the Gospels themselves. So we see the Gospels as we have them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't probably come until the 60s and a little longer. And then John's Gospel comes much later, and then you get the letters of John and Revelation, the Apocalypse of John. That comes right near the end of the first century. So you have this struggle of 100 years between 50 AD to 150. And the struggle in that is because of some of the teaching within the Didache, it makes it questionable on where the date is. And there's some struggle within there are portions that don't seem like they come from quite as early. So let me have a little sip. Earl Grey, if you're wondering. Let's just get into some of these things. There's some details that are kind of interesting. In the early church in the 300s, there was a church historian named Eusebius. He wrote church history. And as we get in, here's the quote. This is from Eusebius, and the reason that I'm laying this out there and putting this on the screen is because he gives us context of the document itself being found within the early church and other letters within the early church. So Eusebius writes, as he's writing about the actual documents within the canon. So what we consider scripture, then within the Catholic Church, then you have the Apocrypha, kind of the intertestamental things and some histories, and then other books, just things that are, this is not a part of scripture, this is not in the Apocrypha, these are just helpful to kind of read through. As he's listing those things out, the early canon trying to come together, he writes, "Let there be placed among the spurious works." Spurious works is more the idea of something that is fake or false, not necessarily that the work is bad, but who they attribute it to is not true. Sometimes we'd use the word pseudo, and that could easily apply here. The spurious works of the Acts of Paul, that's one. The so-called Shepherd, which is a book called, a letter called the Pastor or Shepherd of Hermas. The Apocalypse of Peter, which would be the Revelation of Peter. And besides these, the Epistle of Barnabas. Now, that one's kind of important because we do have other documents of that. And as we'll see in a minute, there are similarities between the Didache and the Epistle of Barnabas. So they seem to arise around the same time. And, as he goes on further, Eusebius, and what are called the teachings of the apostles. So here we have the Epistle of Barnabas and the teaching of the apostles that are these spurious works, these works that, that's probably an epistle that wasn't actually from Barnabas. They just gave it that name. And these actually might be the teachings of the apostles, but the apostles did not write them down. As we look at this, he continues, and here's where it gets kind of interesting. And also the Apocalypse of John, which we know today is the last letter in our Bible, Revelation. So the Revelation of John, and he clarifies this, Eusebius does. "If this be thought proper, for as I wrote before," he gave a list of books that were in the canon, and these are the ones that are not. "I wrote this before, some reject it, but others place it in the canon." So here he's saying the teachings of the 12, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Acts of Paul, a number of these letters are circulating around the time that the Apocalypse of John had been circulating, and some of them include that within this is canon scripture. This is within our Bible of what we call today, and others were saying no, it wasn't. So within this group of letters that the teaching of the 12 belongs to, the Didache, a book that is in our Bible is a part of that group. So that's one of those interesting things that you go, oh, all right. And if we go a little bit further in here, then as we get to the Epistle of Barnabas stuff, within the beginning, the very first portion of the Didache is a section called the two ways. There's a way to life and there's a way to death. As we look at that, and we'll go through those when we actually get to reading the first section, when you look at that, that actually occurs in a number of other letters that we have from manuscripts during New Testament time or just post that time. And we have the Epistle of Barnabas, that this same section that we're going to read through within the Didache is in the Epistle of Barnabas. And the conservative, or at least the range of dates here that we're looking at for the Epistle of Barnabas, we're talking 70 to 135 of when it was written. So this is early. Like, this could be as early as right after Jerusalem and the temple fall to the Romans, up until 135. I can't remember what the specific date is, but it's something with an uprising and a rebuilding of something within Jerusalem. Maybe it's even the temple that gets rebuilt, or a portion of something that gets rebuilt. And the thing to grasp here is portion of the Didache is found in the Epistle of Barnabas, so it seems to be something that doesn't come that was outside of both of those sources. It is an external source. The two ways is the section, is an external source to both of these documents, meaning that it is probably earlier than the Epistle of Barnabas and earlier than the Didache, and sits on its own as this teaching of the two ways, which, as we'll look through, parallels a number of things from the Gospel of Matthew and portions of the Gospel of Luke, but a lot of Matthew. And what I want to do now is give you just a little bit of a Matthew connection, because within the Matthew connection, my own personal view is we have the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we have them in their set now. But when you read through the history stuff of the early church, especially Eusebius, and we'll look at Irenaeus in a minute here, he was one of the early church fathers, as they're writing, they attribute a portion of Matthew, or at least what I would call like proto-Matthew, like pre-Matthew as we have it, like the earliest, most boiled down, like simplest, earliest teachings that the church began to put out. Matthew puts out, but he puts it out in Aramaic or in the Hebrew actual characters. So what we have is Greek that spread throughout, but when the earliest church was beginning, they were still Jewish, following the Messiah. So as he wrote in Hebrew characters, most likely in Aramaic. And as we read here, so here this is Irenaeus of Lyons. He's one of the early church fathers, somewhere around 180. And he writes, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. In their own dialect. That's the portion that I want you to grasp. So, like, we don't have that anywhere. We just have history saying it exists. Just like the Didache shows up on the scene in 1900 almost, we may at some point excavate something, and archaeological findings will find a scroll of the pre-Matthew version that we have in the Hebrew characters. So in their own dialect, in Aramaic, while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome and laying the foundation of the church. So Peter and Paul are off doing their thing. Matthew writes a gospel in the Hebrew characters, is what the Bishop of Lyons, Irenaeus, writes for us in 180. So we're talking less than 100 years after the beginning of the church. I mean, a little bit longer than that if you start factoring in that it was probably somewhere in the 50s maybe. That's why it's interesting that the Didache could possibly be from the 50s. I mean, that would be the earliest date, but so we have Irenaeus saying that. You move in a little further, and we have Eusebius, who writes his church history. He doesn't write until the early 300s, but what he does is he quotes a number of people from early in the church. So he's writing a history from 320-ish, and he's writing things from the past, the near past, not the distant past necessarily. This is church history. And he talks about a bishop named Papias. Papias was one of the bishops that followed in the area of Asia Minor, where John, who wrote Revelation, the Gospel of John, and at least one or some of his letters, depending on how you take that. Papias is in that line of succession. If you're thinking like, okay, how many degrees off are we from Kevin Bacon, but actually from John, the original apostle? You have Papias is in that line. He's the bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, and he wrote, Matthew compiled the sayings of the Lord in the Aramaic language, and everyone translated them as well as he could. So this is from Eusebius writing about a history saying there was an early form of Matthew from Papias. You go a little bit further, and later in time, you get Origen. So let me just say, Papias is probably somewhere around maybe like 130s or so. So 130-ish AD, you get Papias. When we get to Origen, then we're looking significantly later. I mean, not later in the grand scheme of the whole church, but we're looking in like the mid-200s, 240 to 250. And Origen writes, among the four Gospels, which the only indisputable ones in the church, as in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are the only ones that are indisputable. I have learned by tradition that there's a tradition people are using. This is Origen, who was a brilliant person. As he's writing, I've learned by tradition that the very first was written by Matthew. and it was prepared for the converts from Judaism and published in the Hebrew language. So here you see another early church father saying the tradition that lasts throughout these last 300 years is that Matthew wrote the very first gospel to Jewish converts in Hebrew, or the Aramaic dialect in Hebrew characters. This is pretty significant. Pause for a drink break. The significance here is when was the Didache written? Where did it come from? Well, we know that there is something that I would call Proto-Matthew that had some teachings in it. Now, are portions of this teachings, the way, the two ways, found, so Eusebius here tells us that Origen says they used it as converts coming from Judaism, as in those that came into the church right away. How do we bring them in a way that they're going to be familiar, but also give them the teachings of Jesus? I think that there must have been, or could have been, quite possibly been, some overlap between this pre-Matthew and the beginning portions of the Didache. And the reason that I write that is the next slide here is, well, who's the author of the Didache? We have no idea. Nobody attributed it to anyone other than the teachings of the 12, and it doesn't say the 12 wrote these things down. So it is unknown. It is an unknown author, and it is also an unknown editor, because the beginning portion that we'll look at in a moment of how things break down, the beginning portion, the way of life and the way of death, will give you a whole bunch of stuff from the Gospels as we have them now, probably because they were a part of that proto-Matthew, that pre-Hebrew character Matthew set of writings that probably came out somewhere in the 40s or 50s, quite possibly. The first half, I think it's like the first 6 chapters or so, we'll look at it in a second, is one part of the document. The second part of the document is different and has a different sort of structure, and the things that are in there, we'll get to that in a second. So just when you read through it, it's very clunky. It totally looks like somebody, like from our day, when an early college freshman has to write their first term paper in English Comp. There's a lot of cutting and pasting and a lot of right-clicking to add different words. You can just tell that it wasn't original thought. When we get through, as we go through the Didache, you'll be able to see, oh, this first part sounds like it's a whole, and then when you get to the second part, that sounds different. And the very end is maybe even more different. So is this 2 different documents that are edited together? Is it 3 or 4 different documents that are edited together? So who is the author? We don't know, because there's probably multiple authors. Who is the editor that put them all together? We still don't know that either. The only thing we know is Leo wrote down a manuscript and copied it from something earlier, and Philotheos found it in Constantinople around in the late 1800s. So just before 1900, 1873. Let's keep pushing on, just so that for the sake of time, who is the audience of this group? Like, who is actually the people receiving this letter? Now, in some portions of it, it was used, or at least spoken of highly, by people that were in and around Alexandria. We have documents of them talking about this document, the Didache, or the teaching of the 12, or the teaching of the apostles, and it was prominent around Alexandria. This is in Egypt. Huge library there, a whole lot of learning going on there, so it became a part of that kind of environment. It is also highly probable that it was originally written, or at least the portions of it that get to the second half, as we'll look at it in a second. First half is the 2 ways, second half is more church order and liturgy, and what do you do for baptisms and the Lord's Supper and some of those things. That is very likely from around the area of Syria. So maybe the Israel-Palestine area into Syria. And the reason that it's that way is the way that they describe things within the Eucharist, the Thanksgiving, the meal of Thanksgiving, the Lord's table, communion. As they describe that, they use prayers, which are actually if you're in a Reformed setting, one of our liturgy books for when we talk about communion. there's a prayer in there that comes from, as many grain is gathered from these many hills into one loaf, gather your church together. So where are the areas that would actually have hills that you could gather things and grain was scattered over the hills into one loaf? That is in the Israel-Syria sort of area because of the geography. Now that's kind of conjecture, but it's kind of interesting at the same time of where it might come from. Let's keep going. So our audience is partially a more Israel-Syria-based audience, but it gains traction within Alexandria and begins to be copied and such. As we get into the content and the structure of the document itself, in general, is these two areas. The first part is the two ways. And the idea here is that it was quite possibly used for a catechism. So before people would come for baptism, they would have this catechism, and it would explain, here's the way to life, here's the way to death. Like, here are the do's and here are the do-nots. And Paul even does this in the book of Colossians, for example, and a number of other places, but the first one that comes to mind is in Colossians 3. Take off these things, as in shed these garments, like you would for baptism, and then put on compassion and mercy and love, and he makes a whole list of them. Within those things, you can grasp. So we have these two ways that are going around in the early church that find their way into the Didache. That's part one. Part two is more of a manual on church order and practice. So what we've kind of looked at and what I've explained to you is kind of some of the elements that help us with the region in which it's from is you see things that he talks about the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, about baptism, things about what you do with itinerant preachers, prophets, and the very end actually has a section that is more of a what we would consider a revelation or apocalypse, an apocalyptic kind of end time scenario of what things will look like. But that's at the very end. And so when you think about that, you pause for a second and you go, so what was really important in the early church is this two ways. The second thing is the things that they hold important is the tradition of how you do baptisms and how you share in the Lord's table. And then orderly things within the church of specifics of how you should do things and how many days that prophets can be among you before they become people that are just trying to use you. And then you get to the last section of this kind of end time scenario. So these are four elements that seem to be drawn together within the early church as important enough for them to be called the teaching of the 12 apostles, the Didache, the teaching. Here on the thing for us, what I'm going to do is the first actual section that we get on behind this intro video will be the two ways, chapters 1 through 6. And these are small chapters. So if you're worried about it, the length of the book is really about the size of Galatians. It's very short. The two ways is chapters 1 through 6, and those chapters sometimes have like 2 verses in them. So it's just thought patterns. And then the liturgical elements, things for how we do baptism and the Lord's Supper, that's chapters 7 through 10. The church order elements, which is chapters 11 through 15, and then the very end one of the end time stuff, chapter 16. So we will deal with each one of those as they come up, and we'll just read through the text, and I'll make some highlights and some comments, and then maybe give you a few questions for y'all to kind of work through, if you so choose, or maybe ideas of, so do we do these same things? Do we not do these same things? Especially when it comes to baptism or the Lord's Supper. Some of them are similar, and some of them would make you go, wow, if this was in the Bible, it would have sure cleared up a whole lot of division. But then there's the question of, well, did God intend for that conversation to happen in the way that it did? I mean, anyway, I'm getting on a tangent. The Didache, 4 sections that we're going to cover very soon. So this is part 1. This is the intro, gives you a little background, a little history, a little bit to kind of put in your head to go, oh, yeah, I think I might want to kind of go through this. I'm going to try and keep them somewhere around 20 to 40 minutes or so, maybe like the 30-minute mark. I think we're probably close to about 30 minutes now. And as we go through, then what I want it to be is something that is edifying for you, something that maybe reaffirms stuff for your faith, or even just makes you ask the question of why do we do the things that we do, and why are certain things important to us when these things, these four kind of sections, seem to be very important to the early church. So, Didache, somewhere between 50 and 150, and there's that reason, is the two ways is probably very early, and the second part of the document that was edited in is probably later. That kind of Syrian Israel area with the hills and stuff, that began to move out, and you begin to see just a different sort of flow to the document. I think that's all that I want to cover for now. I will put down in the description below a place that you can find an online version if you want to look at that, the Cyril Richardson version that is open source. But yeah, until section 2, where we look at the two ways, the way of life and the way of death. When we actually look at that, I think you'll be surprised, because you go, oh, well, that sure just sounds like the Sermon on the Mount. So until then, thanks, y'all.